every weekend, 24/7. It does not matter.
Tell them what breaking the black barrier mean, man. What they look like?
What is black, man?
What is black?
Copper Color Productions, man. The Copper Color King, King Cash, Morals and Money, man. Let's get it.
Black King, stand up for understand what black is. It's the essence, it's the culture. We've been on this earth, you heard? The Bronx was called for Apache. Huh? The Bronx was called for Apache, man. Oh, last breed, bro. We bringing it back, last breed.
Really forever flying in this bitch, man. For the ancestors, baby. For all the ancestors out there, baby.
Yup. Alright, just this mic real quick. Just this mic. Yup. We are back, man. Copper Color King. Some more breaking the black barrier. We about to break the black barrier just a tad bit more today. We finna go crazy, man. That Juneteenth holiday, man. That holiday be fussing me up. Like, I don't know what it is about it. It's just I can't get jiggy with it, you know? And then you see everybody out here celebrating the holiday. They celebrating the holiday. But do we even know what we truly celebrating, right? They say Juneteenth was the day that the slaves, right, of America were emancipated. That's the day the slaves here in America got emancipated. That's what they say. Right? And a part of that is true. A part of that is true. They say that they came up in the slaves in Texas, and even 2 years after emancipation, they ain't know. Or a year or two after emancipation, right? They ain't know they was free. They still believed that they were in bondage, that they were enslaved. This is the purpose of Juneteenth, right? This is what they tell us. But in all actuality, right, you really got to think about it. Were we actually even given our freedom? Like, were we emancipated and really deemed free citizens, right? Are you free up until this day? Are you free? What it do, Chicken Stew family? What it do? All they tell us, right, is that they freed the slaves, we got our rights, right? But people don't know. See, freeing the slaves was a business transaction. That was a business transaction for those who were in places of high power, right? It benefited so many black people. Of course, you know, we were able to do things that we weren't for such a long time. But it was still a business transaction at the end of the day. It wasn't something that was designated to keep us entirely free. Ask yourself this question. You work a job, right? 40 hours a week. You work a job. Let's say you work 40 hours a week. You got to work for your check, right? You got to pay for water. You do not live off the land. For those who live in cities, right? We fast food and all of that stuff. We're surrounded by it. They call it fast food because it's quick, on the go, right? That's not freedom. That's having to rely on a specific way of living or a lifestyle. That's not freedom, right? Public assistance, right? That's not freedom. None of that stuff is freedom. That's all a form of bondage, slavery, mental slavery, since they can't do it physically no more, right? But that's why I ask, are we truly free? Are black Americans today truly free? I don't know. I don't know what to say. You know, what history tells us is that it was a black and white war, pretty much, like a war on races. But that's not entirely true. See, a lot of people don't know this, right? A lot of people don't know this. America's first slave owners were black. America's first slave owners were black. See, we have two big migration periods that I like to talk about. We got two big migration periods. We have the migration period where you have the first settlers of the Americas coming to the land. This is from the 1600s up until the mid 1700s. That's where we have the Sephardi, the Huguenots, right? Our ancestors, for those whose family members' bloodlines runs that deep, right? The Sephardi, the Huguenots, right? The Germanic people, Moors, right? Black Italians, Black Spanish, Black French, crypto Jews, right? They called these folks Melungeons, Moriscos, right? And when they came to the Americas and mixed in with the indigenous population, they called them mulattoes. Mulatto. So America's first slave owners, they were black. A lot of people don't know or would even begin to understand that, right? That's like a hidden gem. That was like a hidden gem, right? And then one thing I like to make extremely clear to people, right? These slave owners were a part of the U.S. government. They held high places of political status, right? They held a lot of status in these political parties. We got folks like Robert Smalls, Abraham Lincoln, right? The founder of Illinois himself, right? The founder of Illinois and Chicago himself. These people all had high places of political seats, right? Frederick Douglass, Rosa Parks. Sorry, not Rosa Parks. Harriet Tubman. Right? These were people with power, black people with power. And a lot of these folks were Freemasons. Let's start there. A lot of these folks was Freemasons. So we could kind of consider these people to be like the bourgeoisie, the uppity class of black folks, the ones with money, born to free colored families, right? Born to free colored families, the ones with money born to free colored families. And there was a lot of them, you know, like I said, a lot of us come from that ancestral lineage. A lot of us come from that lineage, right? Our ancestors, some of them could have been slave owners, right? And they could have been black. But I say this to say, right? I just wanted to talk about, like I said, Juneteenth and that moment in history overall, what it means today, right? After doing the research, right? And how it affected us, what, 150 years later? Right? 400 years of slavery is really a real thing. I say that 400 years of slavery is really a real thing. And we're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about the Reconstruction era in the United States and what it meant for black people and how this racial divide became a thing. We're going to trickle it all the way down to the political parties of today, the Democrats and the Republicans, in the United States government, in the church itself. Four separate entities. Politics is funny because Republicans and Democrats, you would think this is all government stuff, but neither of them have anything to do with the government. The government is its own entity within itself. But people do not know that. But we're going to talk about it. First and foremost, a lot of people don't even know what Juneteenth is, right? Or even understand the history behind Juneteenth. So we're going to talk about the origins, right? First thing I'm going to do is introduce the origins of Juneteenth to y'all, right? So what is Juneteenth? Juneteenth was originally celebrated in Texas on June 19th, 1866. It marked the first anniversary of the day that black people there first learned of the Emancipation Proclamation, right? Like I told y'all, they say, the story goes that slaves in Texas didn't know they were free until folks came over there and told them, like, hey, you know y'all free, right? And they celebrated. That was 2 years after it was actually issued too, by the way, y'all. The holiday was celebrated with prayer meetings by singing spirituals wearing new clothes to represent newfound freedom. Within a few years, African Americans were celebrating Juneteenth in other states, making it an annual tradition. Right? A new holiday is a tradition now. You know, we get the day off of work, which is also like a slap in the face too, right? Because, like I said, if you work a job, your ass is still a slave. I don't care what anybody say. If you employed, and it's a blessing, but it's still a form of slavery, right? So it's like a slap in the face. Yeah, you get the day off for your little holiday, right? Just like the rest of the holidays, they're all a slap in the face. But what does it mean to be emancipated, right? I like how when you Google this one, they compare this to a child entering adulthood, right? When a child reaches the age of majority, which means adulthood, parents are usually no longer legally obligated to provide for their offspring, with some expectations. The age of adulthood may be 18 or 21. Depending on the law of the specific state, and this formal designation is considered emancipation or freedom for the adult child, right? This is releasing a person from parental care and responsibility. This is what, when you Google it or you Bing it, this is the definition. To be emancipated is like having to go out in the world and figure it out for yourself, right? And at this time, this was a beautiful thing, right? This was a beautiful thing to have to figure it out for yourself, because truth is, a lot of families, right? A lot of families already had it figured out. a lot of families already had it figured out. It wasn't like one of those things where people had to be taught how to crop share and farm and how to like grow crops and stuff. A lot of these people already knew what they were doing. They already knew how to do it. Right? They already knew how to do it. And that's why I show y'all this slideshow, right? Check it out. In one of these pictures, I'm gonna pause for y'all, right? We're gonna talk about it. This right here is Mr. Robert Smalls. He was one of the brothers, one of the formerly enslaved, who played one of the biggest roles in the introduction of the Reconstruction period here in America. Right? It was brothers like this who held power, who had power in America. Most likely, right? And when we look into his biography, right? Born to a free family, right? Born to a free colored family. Right? A free colored family. Right? Which means 9 times out of 10, and a lot of people don't understand this either, his family came from some wealth, right? Whether his father was a white man, quote unquote, right? A white man, a mulatto, either or, didn't really matter. They came from wealth, which goes to show, and it proves that whole idea of black people not coming from anything, or we not having much, you know, it really don't mean nothing, because it was families like this all throughout the United States. All throughout the United States. Right? All throughout the United States. But like I said, people did not know or understand this. Right? I'm trying to put a nice little part of this together for y'all, because we're going to put a lot of this into perspective, right? We're going to put a lot of this into perspective. I want to show y'all who the true slaves were here in America, right? When they say Africans and transatlantic slave trade and this, that, and the third, and whatever the case may be, I want to show y'all who they were really talking about. And we're going to get into it, right? But like I said, Robert Smalls, one of those brothers who here in America had a lot of political power. So his influence on the government at that time swayed the people in a direction to believe and understand that black people had power. You know, we led the charge in the American South. As a matter of fact, a lot of these brothers here, like him, like I said, were Masons and also Republicans, right? And we're gonna see also like the roles Democrats and Republicans truly played in this racial divide and the subjugation of black people of America, right? We're gonna trickle this all the way down to the civil rights movement. That's what we're gonna do. That's how deep we're gonna go into it. But right, just to move forward, like I said, we're gonna go into Robert Smalls' biography, right? Robert Smalls' biography. And you know what? They got several different pictures of this brother, right? Assuming that this may not even be the one, I'm glad they pulled this one up, because this actually put a lot of stuff into perspective too. A black man. See this copper-colored brother, right? Copper-colored brother, Robert Smalls. He was an enslaved African American who became a politician, serving in both the South Carolina legislature and the U.S. House of Representatives. Right? No white man or slave owner taught him how to be this savvy to get himself into these seats, right, in South Carolina. Right? Everybody knows South Carolina to be one of them states now. A lot of racism. They don't like black people. You know, the same story. The same story. Racism, they don't like black people, Commonwealth, this, that, and the third, blah, 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 blah. Well, at one point in time, South Carolina, states like South Carolina, Georgia, right, Louisiana, right, were politically dominated by black people, like Robert Smalls. Just like Robert Smalls, right? Now let's check it out. Who was he? They say an enslaved African American who escaped to freedom in a Confederate supply ship and eventually became a sea captain for the Union Navy. After the war, he became a successful businessman and politician and served in both houses of the South Carolina legislature. He was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1875, but was convicted of taking a bribe while in the state senate and sentenced to prison before he was pardoned by the governor. Right? We don't really know how true this is, right? Could be a setup. But he was born to a house enslaved person, Lydia Polite, in Beaufort, South Carolina, on April 5th, 1839. Right? Like now, like this is, remember what I said. The brother had to be educated. Right? This ain't no slave education. He had to be educated in politics to understand the United States government. He had to be educated in politics. Right? The identity of his father is not officially known, but it's believed to be Henry McKee. McKee, an Irish surname, right? McKee, Key, Irish surname. The son of the plantation's owner. Smalls was raised in the McKee house and enjoyed a little more acceptance in the community, right? They say he was enslaved, right? But he was accepted in the community. This brother wasn't enslaved. He was most likely family, because slaves were not accepted in the community, right? He ignored night curfew for black people and stayed out with his white companions, much to his mother's lament. Right? This with the idea and the theory that everything was all black and white at that time, like, oh, black versus white. But a lot of these white people, quote unquote, were also black. They were also black. Speaking of Teddy Roosevelt, he got black ancestry too. Actually, just saw a video about that today. And you know who else got black ancestry? Let me show y'all. Right? Let me show y'all who else got black ancestry. Hold on, right? This one had me stoked, because we're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about it. I ain't going to lie. This brother right here, right? Check this out. Check this out. And people might not even recognize it. People might not even recognize him. This brother, this is J. Edgar Hoover. He has black ancestry. J. Edgar Hoover has black ancestry. The brother responsible for locking so many black people up, black men up. J. Edgar Hoover has black ancestry, but a lot of people don't know that. We're going to talk about it. Like I said, we're going to talk about it, right? But yeah, let's drop this real quick. Like I said, right, these black folks, these quote unquote enslaved African Americans, come from like rich families. And a lot of families came over here, right, already Masons. Right, they were already Masons back where they were from, in England, or in Europe, shall I say. They were already Masons. They came from families who were a part of kingdoms in a much later time, right? They come from powerful families, and coming here to America, they could have came here as indentured servants or exiles, right? Exiles, castaways. These are the type of folks that they was calling slaves. Like, they was calling these folks slaves. Why? Because, well, they have to hide the fact that a lot of these people have power. Like, a lot of slaves had power. A lot of slaves were educated, smart, rich, wealthy, right? Wealthy. But in order to control the narrative, right, you got to make sure that these people remain slaves, right? Listen to this. Check this out. Like, look, this is what I mean. They got to keep this stuff hidden. Listen to this part.
What's good, y'all? It's the Copper Color King. We back in this bad boy with some more good content, man. I got a clip for y'all, man. They keep this stuff inside the movies and the TV shows. Listen to what they say. How is it politically wrong for the crown, for the queen, the crown, Prince Harry and them to reveal that they have black blood? What are they hiding? What political affairs are they trying to avoid? What lines would they be crossing, man? Things that make you think. Go back in history, man. We gotta do the research. Drop a comment. Let me know what you
I
think.
always loved this portrait of our ancestor, Queen Charlotte.
Even a lifetime special based on the romance of the present-day Duke and Duchess chimed in.
Oh, yes. You're of mixed race, Harry. So am I.
Why doesn't the Queen just come out and say it?
She can't. She may not. It's one of the things that the royal family cannot do. She will be stepping into political water.
You're saying.
All right. Now, check this. The royal family, right? The royal family, the queen, she even has black blood. But like they just stated, they wouldn't be able to admit it or come out clean about it because of the simple fact, right? Because of the simple fact that they would be stepping into political political lines. They'll be crossing political lines. If the queen admitted to her black ancestry, they'll be crossing political lines. They cannot do it. Right? Like I said, these people, they gotta hide under different identities, because identifying with black is just like identifying with a slave. And it's been like this for a long time. So like I say, right, are we truly emancipated? They call us black today, but what is black? What can you identify with? These people, right, they identify as black, but they know their truest ancestry, right? This is the first colored Senate and representatives and the 41st and 42nd Congress in the United States. These are all copper-colored brothers with some European ancestry. For sure that. We could bet on it, right? But more back to Robert Smalls, though, right? When he was 12, like he said, the McKee family moved to Charleston, where Smalls was hired as a day laborer on the waterfront, working as a rigger and eventually a sailor, right? He was hired. When he was 12, he was hired. So if he was born to an enslaved person, right, this is before emancipation, 30-something years before emancipation, right? He was hired as a day laborer, so they was paying him. He wasn't enslaved. They was paying him. That's different. The treatment is different. The situation is different, right? In 1856, he married Hannah Jones, an enslaved hotel maid who worked in Charleston. Jones already had one daughter, and together she and Smalls had a daughter and a son, Robert Jr., who died of smallpox. Smalls' attempts to buy his wife and family out of slavery failed. Gunboat deckhand. At the outbreak of the Civil War, in March 1861, Smalls was hired as a deckhand on a Confederate supply ship. He was a Confederate. The Planter, and converted cotton steamer that carried supplies between forts in Charleston Harbor. Over the course of several months, Smalls learned all he could about navigating the ship and waited for an opportunity to escape. His escape. In the pre-dawn hours of May 13, 1862, while the white officers and crew slept in Charleston, Smalls and a crew of 8 men, along with 5 women and 3 children, including Smalls' wife and 2 children, quietly slipped the Planter out of Charleston Harbor. Over the next few hours, Smalls successfully navigated the ship through 5 checkpoints, offering the correct signal to pass each, and then headed out to open the waters in the Union blockade. It was daring and dangerous, and if caught, the crew was prepared to blow up the vessel. The startled crew of the USS Onward, the first ship in the blockade to spot the planter, almost fired on it before Smalls had the Confederate flag struck and raised the white bedsheet, signaling a surrender. The ship's treasure of guns, ammunition, and important documents proved to be a wealth of information, telling the Union commanders of shipping routes, mine locations, and the times that the Confederate ships docked and departed. Right, so he became an asset to the Union. Otherwise, they most likely, like, right, I want people to understand something. They were slaving people up here in the North too. Right, the Union had a lot of slaves. They were slaving folks left and right. But they were more into it for business purposes, right? Like Harriet Tubman's true purpose, right? That Underground Railroad, it was really to bring slaves back and forth, north and south, through the south and through the north, back and forth. And she was getting paid to do it too. They was paying shorty. Not the high school story that we learned, that's false. And we're going to talk about that much later. Not today though. Definitely not today. Right, so he was now known as a wartime hero and spokesperson. The story of the courageous escape of Smalls became a national phenomenon and was one of the factors encouraging President Abraham Lincoln to authorize free African Americans to serve in the Union military. Right? They authorized it because he became an asset to the military. A super asset, right, for what he did. Right, this had nothing to do with color. What he did allowed him to become an asset. Congress bestowed a $1,500 cash prize on Smalls, and he went on a speaking tour, recounting his heroics and recruiting African Americans to serve in the Union Army. During the rest of the war, Smalls balanced his roles as a spokesperson and the Union Navy captain on the planter and the ironclad USS Keokuk, conducting 17 missions in and around Charleston. Right. The brother was already smart, right? He already knew how to sail boats and all of that. Like, he was witty, right? He was a real asset, skilled. He conducted missions, stole a boat, freed some people. This is Robert Smalls. This is the man who became a political entity. I mean, a powerful political man. I said an entity, sorry. Right? After the war, he was commissioned as a brigadier general in South Carolina militia and purchased his former owner's house in Beaufort, South Carolina. He generously took in some of the McKee family who were destitute. Smalls started a general store, a school for African American children, and a newspaper. His success opened doors in politics, and soon he served as a delegate to the state's constitutional convention and was elected to both South Carolina's House of Representatives and the state representative. Between 1874 and 79, he served in the United States House of Representatives, but his tenure was marred by partisan accusations that he took a $5,000 bribe while in the state Senate. In 1877, Smalls was convicted of these offenses and sentenced to 3 years in prison. All right, so the brother, born basically free because he was paid to be a laborer. He wasn't a slave. He was paid to be a laborer. And then he was known for stealing a gunboat at the outbreak of the Civil War and bringing it to the Union, where they received ammunition, supplies, and information, documents, right? That played a huge role in possibly in the Union winning the war. He brought his former slave owner's house, right? And then brought in some of the McKee family. Right now, the destitute McKee family. What is the definition of destitute? Lacking money, possessions, or any of the things needed to live. This family that quote unquote enslaved him, all right, or where his father comes from, who is the son of the plantation's owner, right? So this enslaving family, like this plantation only family, was poor. They were poor. And when he brought his former slave owner's crib, he brought the family in. So, like I said, was he really a slave? Like, was he a slave, or was this like, were they all family to begin with, together? Right? He mingled with white companions, quote unquote, and then became a political entity for black people. The brother didn't even grow up hanging out with black people. The brother didn't even grow up hanging out with black people. So it's crazy how he's known for so many of these great things for black people, but he didn't even grow up experiencing what other black people experienced, copper-colored people. It's kind of crazy, right? Kind of odd when you think about it. Like I said, the brother was a Mason. He was a part of an organized group of Freemasons. All of these men in suits, Freemasons. Right? Families taking them back to Europe. Their families come from Europe. Like I said, same thing with this brother right here, J. Edgar Hoover. Right? But enough of the funny talk. Enough of the funny talk. Let me show y'all, right? We got the book. All right, what is this? The Reconstruction era, the book of the Reconstruction era. We're going to talk about it. Like I said, from 1861 to 1900. And what is the Reconstruction era? Well, the Reconstruction era was just a time period where black people were rebuilding the societies that were destroyed by the evil white folks. Like, that's what they say, right? This is the story. The evil white folks, right? That's what it is. That's the Reconstruction era. And a lot of this was happening around the time of the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, the death of Abraham Lincoln, and the presidency of Andrew Jackson. You know, Andrew Jackson himself was a racist. However, he advocated for a lot of these things that the black folks, right, the bourgeoisie at the time, were pushing for, right? He advocated for a lot of it. But we're going to talk about it, right? We're going to talk about it. Like I said, we're going to talk about it. Oh, look, right, some parts right here, just to give y'all an introduction to the book. We're just going to read some of these highlighted parts real quick, right? So what does it say? The first one I got is, like so many Americans dating back to the earliest days of British settlement, former slaves hoped to farm their own land and grow food crops to support their families and communities, right? Like so many Americans dating back to the early days of British settlement, former slaves hoped to farm their own land. Why? Because these former slaves were the folks living in these British settlements. This is why they say, like so many Americans dating back to those days. Right? Merchants and planters alike, Moors and Jews, right? Black folks, swarthy black folks who knew the land already, right? Or who were taught the land by the aboriginals that they mixed with. Merchants, people who were already coming over here with merchant experience, right? They believed the future of the South was in cash crops grown on large plantations, and they sought ways to get staple production back on its feet. Right? This is about Abraham Lincoln. What they say, he had approved nascent reorganized state governments that did not extend suffrage to freedmen. Lincoln himself, right? He wasn't the big free the black people man, right? He advocated what was right in terms of business, right? Because why else would he be approving nascent reorganized state governments that did not extend suffrage to freedmen? Suffrage. They did not extend suffrage to freedmen, right? He was one of those folks that was drawing a line. Like, freedmen can only get a certain amount of things, right? Even though Lincoln himself was a black man. People don't know this. Abraham Lincoln described it himself in his own autobiography, which we're going to talk about in a later episode. He was a black man. I'll even post a clip on my channel, right? Because I put it on TikTok already. Right, Lincoln died, but Andrew Jackson, he was a Tennessee Unionist who, although a former slave owner, had made his career as an opponent of the planter elite. Right, because Jackson also grew up poor. I mean, Johnson also grew up poor. Yeah, Andrew Johnson, sorry. He also grew up poor. Right, this is why he was an opponent of the planter elite, but still advocated for slavery. You have weird stuff like that happening. Like when we talk about it, it was weird stuff like that. Like, pick a side. It would make you think, like, pick a side. Which one? Be against them or be with them? But at that time, people got to understand it wasn't like that. It wasn't all black and white how people make it out to be. But you had a lot of poor white people, a lot, who owned slaves. And you had a lot of rich white people who went against slavery and some who owned slaves. Right? Johnson, he didn't insist that they allow black men to vote. He at first barred wealthy ex-Confederates from taking part in the process, hoping that Unionist Yeomen would take control over Southern politics. Right, what else we got? Right, we're going to talk about this too. The new state governments in turn passed black codes that excluded African Americans from testifying in court and criminalized them if they tried to secure new contracts. Right, black codes came in every different colonizing group. Right, the Spaniards had it, the French had it, right, British had it, the Americans had it. Black codes, Code de New York. That's something that been prevalent with them, right? They've been on that. They was just reintroducing it year after year in new language on new documents. Right? What else we got? After the resounding victory in the 1866 midterm elections, congressional Republicans launched a sweeping effort to remake the former Confederacy. The Confederacy was remade, dividing the region into military districts. Congress passed legislation instructing the Army to help register African American men as voters and create new biracial governments in the South. And the Republicans viewed temporary military rule was justified because conditions in the region remained so chaotic and because some white Southerners remained so hostile to the U.S. government. Right? White Southerners hostile to the U.S. government. They wasn't jacking them. But why? Because they took away their property, right? They returned them back to their former status of being low-class citizens. They took their wealth away once they were free because it allowed these black folks who were once wealthy and free to regain their own wealth. This is what caused the racial divide. Even though it always been like a they don't like black people thing, it became an extreme part of the world we see today because of stuff like this. Right? Because of stuff like this. Look, even Johnson even tried to impede Republican goals in 1866 and 67 by vetoing the Civil Rights Bill. Right? Civil rights movement was something that would have been happened after emancipation. The Freedmen's Bureau extension and the Military Reconstruction Acts, Republicans repeatedly overruled his vetoes, right? They overruled his vetoes. Black Republicans overruled his vetoes. When Johnson sought to use his power as commander-in-chief to undermine the Congressional Act, the House of Representatives impeached him in 1868, and the Senate came with one vote of conviction. Boy got impeached and almost got convicted for wanting to go against the black Republicans, right? That's how much power these bourgeoisie black folks had, right? But in that same token, you know, you got to actually learn to appreciate it, right? because just look at what we as colored people overall were able to accomplish, right? Listen to this. In 1868, the Republicans, bolstered by the votes of African American men in the South, right? This is also big too, because this was the predominant vote. Black people, mulattoes, African Americans, made up the majority. So they needed their vote in order to remain in power. In addition to that, you had copper colored folks in Congress, right? Like they just said, like we saw in the photo. Going back to it, see the Masons. You go back to it, the first colored senator and representatives. And in this photo, it's 7 of them. So I can only imagine how many more black people made up the government at the time, or the Republican Party in general. Right, in general. But more so, man, let's dive deep into it, man. Let's dive deep into it. Let's talk about it, right? What is this? Part 1. Land and labor of the Reconstruction era. Right? As wartime conditions loosened the bonds of slavery, black and white Southerners began a delicate and protracted process of remaking the conditions of life and labor. Black and white people both. Right? Around this time on the census, right, people were identifying with either or. Going into the 1900s, this is what you've seen on the census, but these white people were mulattoes too. They had a black blood as well. They were just light skinned, extremely light, and didn't have all of the features of a black person, of thick lips, the chunky nose, right? These beautiful features we got. Free people across the South, like many whites, aspired to own land and grow fruit crops. Like rural people around the globe, they envisioned themselves as subsistence farmers, hoping to raise enough to feed themselves and their families and perhaps grow some staple crops for sale. Across the South, free people had expressed a desire to stay on the lands they knew. Many believed they had a right to that land, having worked it so long with no compensation, right? But like we just saw, like this is why I say, like, they like to keep you in that trance to believe that folks was just working and being slaves like that. But like we just saw, at 12 years old, the man Smalls was being paid. He was paid to do what he did. They paid him to do what he did, right? To partake in the stuff he partook in. So dodge that, right? We got to pack that up. Folks was being compensated. He was just in a different class of black people. After decades under race-based slavery, they also sought a measure of independence from white people in particular. Working for themselves as opposed to under white supervision was especially important to them. The impact of the war upon land and labor in the South was evident from the war's first days. A month after the attack on Fort Sumter, slaves working at Confederate military fortifications in Virginia escaped to U.S.-occupied Fort Monroe. Right, Fort Sumter and Fort Monroe, these two places are going to be extremely important. Extremely important. Fort Sumter and Fort Monroe. Right, these stargates. Right, these areas, they stargates. After Major General Benjamin Butler refused to allow their masters to retrieve them, hundreds more followed, establishing a vast colony of escapees from slavery in the neighboring towns of Hampton. U.S. military officials and northern journalists soon began calling the runaways contraband of war. Right, these were one of the terms given to the black folks, right, who were escaping the South, or that was working at the Confederate military fortifications in Virginia. And they fled to Fort Monroe. Where's Fort Monroe, right? Is it in the North? right? It's on the southern tip of the Virginia Peninsula. Right, so they remained south. If anything, started pushing further south. So they didn't even escape to the north. Oops. They didn't even escape to the north. After Major General Benjamin Butler refused to allow their masters to retrieve them, right, he dubbed them. He said, nah, you can't go back after them. You know, basically, like, let them be free. Let them be free. They're not worth chasing after, basically, right? But they were still coined contrabands of war, right? This the 1860s. They gave us many names: monkeys, blackface, right? Mad different names: Negro, you know, mulatto, mestizo, criollo. There's wild different names that black people today would have went by back in the day. The term was widely used in international law. This was a law term, but novel in its application to people. It suggested the runaways in between and somewhat yet uncertain legal status, right? In between or somewhat uncertain legal status, right? These runaways, right? But if you in between, right? If you legal, that wouldn't even make you a runaway. That wouldn't even make you a runaway. So like, that's why I'm saying that it was a lot going on, man. A lot going on. Why do you have legal people running away? What was the point? Right? Could it be to switch factions? Or right, would it be because they were helping other slaves escape to the other side? Right? Were these freedmen, like these copper-colored freedmen, right, sabotaging from within? Coup d'etats? Right? Possible. It's possible. Let's see. Their former owners no longer held them as property, and yet the U.S. government had yet to ratify their freedom. See, as the United States captured additional forts and territory on the Atlantic coast in the winter of 1861 and 1862, free people moved to newly reconquered bases, establishing encampments often known as contraband camps near New Bern, North Carolina, Beaufort, South Carolina, and the Sea Islands of South Carolina and Georgia, and among other places. Places now like New Bern, that's like the boonies. You got a lot of white people that live over there, though. You know, a lot of Caucasian folks that live over there. Right? It's not what we know it as today. You also have a lot of mixed race people that live over there. Mulattoes, that they would call them, right? And as a matter of fact, the history of New Bern consists of Tuscaroras and Huguenots. Cherokees, Tuscaroras, and Huguenots. So that's a big drop right there, right? They moved into that land, right? Further south. They went further south. Not north, further south. With the United States victory in New Orleans in April 1862, thousands of former slaves along the Mississippi River came under the management of federal government. At many of these sites, ex-slaves, U.S. Army officers, missionaries, northern businessmen, and their former masters negotiated over terms of labor and land possession. In Mitchellville on Hilton Head Island, former slaves established a self-governing community amid the military occupation. Right, this is the 1860s. Folks is establishing self-governing communities. Black folks, former slaves. So them same people that they told us didn't know how to read and write were smart enough to self-govern themselves once they reached or found freedom. These slaves that couldn't read or write. As a matter of fact, who were these slaves? Right? Who were these slaves? Like I said, we talk about it, right? What it say? Virginians also expanded their trade in Indian slaves overseas. In 1716, Captain Harry Beverly and his ship were captured by the Spaniards. Many Indian slaves were on board, undoubtedly being transported to the West Indies for sale. Right? Indians were being made slaves for punishment. As punishment from the 1600s up until the 17 and early 1800s. But by the time the 1800s came about, these people were already mixed. A lot of them were already mixed in. And also on the Caribbean islands. Right, look, the Notaways, Meherines, Nasamons, Pamunkeys, they all sent children. Indian slaves, that's who the slaves were. That's who the slaves were. The true slaves, cheer. Right, so these former slaves, Aboriginal peoples, reestablished. Let's say reestablished. We're gonna say reestablished. We're not gonna say established, because that's like saying they never had it before. They reestablished self-governing communities. Because, like I'm showing y'all, they already held all the weight. They already held all the weight. Indian slaves in America. They tell us as Africans. But we debunked that, right? Indian slavery in colonial Virginia and South Carolina. Right? Indian populations on both continents were ravaged by deadly disease introduced by the Europeans, wars between colonists, and Indians further decreased the Indian population. That's what they say. They say that's what took them out. But it was really slavery. And we went over these in older live streams. You guys should go check them out, right? Indian slavery in all original 13 colonies peaked around or before 1700 and declined in importance to the 18th century. Why is that? Why is that? Because these Indians were then reclassified as blacks. Like the terms changed, right? Because these Indians were provided with treaties and land grants and provided with land, right? But if you don't identify with anything, if you identify as just a black, then we don't got to give you any of that. Do your thing, big dog. Do your thing. We're gonna keep killing it, man. We're gonna keep killing it. Right, but these Indians were reclassified as blacks. Right? They're reclassified. But they still enslaved them. This is where slavery was most prominent for them. They said it peaked in the 1700s. The Spanish enslaved them. The French enslaved them. Right? Like I said, Code de New York. Black codes. Black codes. Code de New York. 4 years later, the French government, under direction of Bennyville, we're gonna get back into this stuff a lot later too. And this guy Bennyville, you know, we're gonna get into him too. Bennyville. Hey, oh, they're not gonna tell us what that. I bet it's alright. That's fine. I'm gonna save it because it's real smoke. But they issued a Code de New York tailored to the needs of their neglected, struggling colony. Based on the 1685 Code de New York written in Saint Domingue, the 1724 Louisiana law aimed to limit manumission and African influence, prevent the development of maroon communities, and regulate racial intermixture. Because you had these Frenchmen mixing with the Indians. That's where the term French Indians comes from, right? French Indians. Now we're not going to talk about the India, but the French Indians. That's where that term, like in Spanish Indians, that's where these terms come from. Right? But like I said, these were the former slaves. They reestablished self-governing communities amid the military occupation. And check this out. What is this? General Steedman and Fullerton confirmed with the freedmen in their church at a Trent River settlement. Illustration by Theodore R. Davis. Right? Mad freemen in a church. This is just a depiction. There's a lot of them though. A lot of them. And 9 times out of 10, the artist was very, very, very stereotypical, and most likely racist for making them all look alike. That's what these artists do when they paint these pictures, even with the white people. They make them all look alike. They make them all look alike. Like they never look any different, right? Like you look at European kings from the past, you look at their photos on Google. The only difference is some may have a beard, some may not. Some might have longer hair, some may have shorter hair. But their pictures all to paint them to look alike. So the freedmen, it was very diverse. These groups of freedmen. Like I showed y'all. We're going to show y'all again. This is what they look like. These freedmen. That's what they look like. Right? That's what they look like. Hey, J. Edgar Hoover. Right? I got another one for y'all. These freedmen. Where we at? These freedmen. These Masons. These freedmen. That's what they look like. Right? Look at this. The Freedmen's Bureau. They said the Freedmen's Bureau was an agency to keep the Negro in idleness at the expense of the white man. Twice vetoed by the president and made a law by Congress. They said the Freedmen's Bureau was created to keep the Negro in idleness at the expense of the white man. Told y'all they was mad. They was mad because we took the land. We took our land back, shall I say, and reestablished self-governing communities. And they was big mad. They was big mad. Right? Many of these tensions were on display in a famous meeting between Major General William T. Sherman and a group of black religious leaders in the Savannah, Georgia home of Charles Green. On January 12th, oh look, black religious leaders in the 1800s, black religious leaders. No, these was not Africans and them coming over from West Africa preaching Yoruba and Christianity and all of that. No, these were them folks with that ancestry that I keep speaking about. For sure. On January 12th, 1865, Sherman and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton asked a group of black ministers what free people wanted. Reverend Garrison Fraser responded that freedom meant taking us from under the yoke of bondage and placing us where we could reap the fruit of our own labor, take care of ourselves, and assist the government in maintaining our freedom. Right? The plan was to assist the government from the jump. Right? A lot of these slaves fought in the American Revolution in 1776. Right? A lot of these black men, ancestors, fought in the Revolution. Indians alike as well. Indians alike as well. Oh, so it's not this book, alright. But we got some smoke on that, though. We definitely got some smoke on that, right? Indian slaves could be found in South Carolina into the 19th century. The process of enslavement ended several decades before the turn of the century. However, during the American Revolution, several loyalists joined with the Senecas and Cherokees to fight the South Carolina Patriots. Right? A lot of these aboriginals fought in these wars. A lot of our ancestors fought in these wars. Check your ancestry records. Right? You'll see it. Like, if you go deep enough, you'll see that you got family members who fought in this war or fought in that war, or American Revolution this, American Revolution that, on either side. Right? The aboriginals didn't understand why they was fighting. The point, they just wanted to benefit. Like, how does this help us? We're gonna side with whatever side refuses to enslave us and would help us. But it was all a plan to sabotage in the first place. Right? But back into it. The best way they could take care of ourselves was to have land and turn it to it by our own labor. This is the definition of emancipation. We want to be placed on land until we are able to buy it and make it our own. When asked whether they would live scattered among the whites or in colonies by yourselves, many agreed that they preferred to live by ourselves, for there is a prejudice in the South that will take years to get over: segregation. This 1865 meeting helped spark one of the most ambitious experiments in remaking land and labor in the former Confederate States. Sherman, hoping to disperse the thousands of slaves who had followed his army on its march through Georgia in hopes of securing their freedom, offered to give free people license to settle on the abandoned plantations. They offered to give free people licenses to settle on abandoned plantations, right? This was like a move to the south, right? We're gonna give you your land, like allow you to be emancipated in peace, people of emancipation in peace, free people in peace. This is what was going on in the South, and it's so different now, right? It's so different right now, and a lot of this has to do with propaganda, but we're gonna learn about that like a little later. Sherman's Special Field Order 15 marked one of the few moments that the U.S. government attempted to distribute land to former slaves. On the Sherman Reserve, free people immediately began settling land and farming for themselves. Sherman Reserve. Where is that today? Well, they said it, but let's see if we could get some images. Is this the same thing? Oh, this is probably not even the same thing. Let's say this is Nebraska. I wanted to get to see what it would look like today, if anything. But yeah. Elsewhere, the story was far different, and even the Sherman Reserve would quickly come to grief. In most places in the former Confederacy, as the Civil War ended, white Southerners remained in possession of the lands they had held before the war. In some places, however, planters and farmers had fled, and free people and others had taken up residence and were building communities on their own terms. This is the true American South. All that black people who ain't have nothing, couldn't read, not blase, blah. This is why they were mad. This is the truth. They were mad because we was doing stuff like that. Yeah, you see, a lot of our family members got wrapped up in that. Right, a lot. Right, but this is the true American South. But you have free people moving in and taking the land, right? In some places, planters and farmers had fled. They were fleeing. Some remained in possession of their lands that they held, and some were fleeing. But free people was most definitely moving in. And this became the start of the rise to power for quote unquote free people in the South. And in some instances, the U.S. government had confiscated land belonging to individual Confederates. By the end of the war, then free people had established themselves on land and were farming in places like Roanoke Island, North Carolina, the outskirts of Norfolk, Virginia, and in some locations along the Mississippi River. For a brief period in 1865, it was unclear whether prominent Confederates would be permitted to reclaim such confiscated land. But former Confederates found a willing ally in President Andrew Johnson. Right, he stood for that. He was with that. I'm telling y'all. Right, he assumed office in April 15th, 1865 after Lincoln's assassination. Although Johnson initially excluded large landholders in the Confederate States from general amnesty, thus raising hopes that he would demand that they turn over part of their lands in exchange for pardons, right, his actions soon disappointed free people and their allies. Who were their allies? Well, of course, the U.S. government, right, white folks in power, right, these people working together to create a prosperous America, right, to make money. Like, to make America great, hence make it great. And it was great at some point, hence make it great again. Wonder who y'all voting for this year, man. Vote. I advocate everybody vote. They vote. Please vote this year. Make the right choice. In October, he ordered the head of the Freedmen's Bureau, Major General O. Howard, to restore the Sherman Reserve lands to their former owners once he had pardoned them. By January 1866, the Freedmen's Bureau, which was charged with administering confiscated land, retained a little more than half the land once under its jurisdiction. and roughly half of that was in Sherman Reserve along the coast of South Carolina and Georgia. So Johnson, right, Andrew Johnson, right, got the head of the Freedmen's Bureau to restore the Sherman Reserve land back to the plantation owners, back to the slave owners. So Johnson was on that. Johnson was trying to keep people in color out of places of power, right? And save the seats for the white man, right? But like I told y'all, a lot of these people, these white folks back then too, they were against rich white people because they grew up poor. But that also didn't mean that they were against all other white people, Caucasian people, shall I say. Right? They wanted to keep those folks in their community still and build their community. So his reasons for hating the Caucasian elite, or the elite at the time, shall I just say, was because he was less, like he had less. He was poor. But still, he didn't want no colored folks to have any of that land because they believed that they had rights to that land. Right? This is what a lot of these folks believed, that they had rights to that land. The plantation owners believed they had rights to the land. Created by Congress in March 1865, the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, commonly known as the Freedmen's Bureau, was supposed to oversee the South transition from slave labor to free labor. Not free labor, you know, working for yourself, yeah, that's like entrepreneurship, but also paid labor. So it's not slave labor, it's paid labor. It's still labor. You're just getting paid for it now. Or you could do it yourself. Headquartered in Washington, D.C., the Bureau established outposts, typically staffed by active U.S. Army officers or recently discharged veterans, in cities and towns throughout the former Confederacy. Bureau agents located their offices in existing buildings, including hotels and offices. However, the Freedmen's Bureau commissioner had considerable sympathy for former slaves, trying to hold on to land confiscated from former Confederates, right? The commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau was trying to help former slaves, you know, trying to work with them, right? Holding on to the confiscated land to give it to the former slaves. And it says, when coastal planters from Georgia and South Carolina demanded that Sherman lands be returned to them, Howard tried to intervene. Johnson and his policy of restoration of land, however, won out, and the majority of the lands were returned. Some free people did manage to establish title to Sherman Reserve lands, and others in the area purchased small tracts from the planters, making coastal South Carolina and Georgia one of the few places in the former Confederacy where black land ownership became widespread and relatively secure. Right, but it was all for business though, because like I said, this is all a business play, right? To keep these people out the land. They want to own the land so that they could be in control of the wealth. Slave labor built the country. And it's sad. People don't like to hear it, but it's the truth. Slave labor built the America that we see today. Right? It funded the wars. All right, we're going to talk about the wars that Spain had with Britain. It funded those wars, right? This is why they had slaves over here in the first place, so that they can exploit the land and then return those exploitations back to their side, so that they can continue building or becoming powerful entities, powerful governments. That was the purpose of slave labor, to keep rising in power. Right? It's just like today where you have everything made in China. We get most of our goods from China. So the more we fund their pockets, the more they rise in power. They control the financial market. This is what slave labor did, right? Spain had the biggest armada. But once Britain got control over the colonial lands in America, they became a powerful entity. And that was because of slave labor. Understand that. African American spokesmen and other leaders emerged, some of whom would later become prominent in Reconstruction politics, and others whose identities remain difficult to trace, right? Remain difficult to trace. Why were they difficult to trace? Right? Because you're using this term African American. You will never find their ancestors if you keep tracing them back to hair, because they don't come from Africa. Bruce Lee, what up, my brother? How you feeling? How you feeling? How you feeling, my brother? Right, but this is why they can't trace the identities of these African American spokesmen, because they don't come from Africa. Right? But anyway, general, we want homesteads. A community from Edisto Island, South Carolina wrote, we were promised homesteads by the government. Free people argued that they always been loyal Americans. Right? Free people argued that they always been loyal Americans. Like I told y'all, these freed people, these Masons, like, right, with European blood, right, who came over here because of like the Inquisition and all that good stuff. Bad stuff, sorry. The freed people, right? First colored Senate and representatives, right? This is what I always tell people. For them to have knowledge on how American government works means they come from a place where that knowledge was taught. So if most Europeans, right, came over here with their knowledge of how government works, which is similar to these things, right, like a Senate, just the U.S. government overall, wouldn't they have gotten their information from the same place, like from the monarchies and kings and queens of Europe? This is where the government comes from, right? American Revolution didn't change how government worked, right? All it did was it allowed colonists here in America to govern themselves. So they still had systems that came from Europe, right? However, they just were able to govern themselves. Like, no more using Britain pound, Britain's money. We don't got to use Britain's money. We could just use our own money and use the same tax systems, all of these different systems, use all of that stuff here in America, right? We'll be twice as rich as what they are over there in Europe, right? We just copy the same stuff. We were already rich before a lot of us were exiled or told that if we didn't convert to Christianity or Catholicism, that we would be killed, murdered, families murked off. Nah, we just gonna go to America, right? And then we're gonna build our own government here. And once we get strong enough, we're gonna fight back. It happened in Mexico too. 40 years before the American Revolution. Sorry, before the Civil War. 40 years before the Civil War. Mexico, the people of Mexico achieved their freedom in 1821 and modeled it off of the American Revolution. However, Mexico's revolution was led by, right, Criollos. Those people being the bourgeoisie. They would claim that they're the Aboriginal Mexicans, but they really just the uppity Spanish with indigenous blood, some indigenous blood. The same thing goes for a lot of the freed people. They're Masons. They come from wealth, right? They come from wealth. But this is why they say they argued that they've always been loyal Americans. Our ancestors fought in the American Revolution. How can you not hook us up? You hate us now for what? This is why I say America had two extreme waves of migration. The one where the Sephardi and the Huguenots came, and then the one where the Ashkenaz and the Jews of Russia and Germany and all of that came to America, which was in the 1800s. And they brought a lot of these ideologies, like Walter Pleckler's, right? We always talk about him. But like Walter Pleckler, they brought a lot of these ideologies over. Institutional racism, one drop rule, the Racial Integrity Act of 1924. Right, they come from that's the set. They came here in America during that second wave. Right, see, the son of a Confederate veteran and slave owner. Walter Pleckler. Walter Pleckler, man. One of them folks that we just gotta point the finger at when we mention in racism and foundations and assholes and whatnot. They argued that they always been loyal Americans, having provided soldiers to the Union cause and done all they could to defeat the Confederacy. Having provided, centuries of uncompensated labor also entitled them to the land. Many argued, as one Alabama Freedmen's Convention put it, the property which they hold was nearly all earned by the sweat of our brows. Although in some cases, free people negotiated a right to rent the lands they had come to occupy. And in some cases, white owners proved willing to sell it to them. As a rule, free people struggled to acquire land in the early post-war years. So after the Civil War, they had a hard time. Because a lot of these folks were trying to cling on to what they had left. Not because they didn't want to sell it to them because they were black, but they didn't want to lose their wealth. These white folks ain't want to lose their wealth. Some cases you see, like, white owners proved willing to sell. Right? It was all about wealth. If you had it like that, you had it. If you didn't, you didn't. But what we know about war, war leaves all people broke. The war will leave both parties broke, especially a war like the Civil War. A nasty, disgusting war like that, right? Which could have devastated the economy early on, right? It leaves all parties broke. Across most of the South, as African Americans gave clear expression to their desire for land, politicians and white landowners mobilized all the resources they could to stymie them. That effort was evident in southern state houses, where legislators passed laws designed to ensure that former slaves would work for white landowners and to make it harder for them to farm for themselves. Right? In southern state houses, legislators passed laws designed to ensure that former slaves would work and make it harder for them to farm for themselves. When you work for someone, you strip away your ability to do it for yourself. This is why I ask people today, you so hype about Juneteenth, right? You just as misinformed as them folks who didn't know that they were free in Texas. Because now it's like, yo, bro, somebody got to knock on the door and remind you, hey, you're not all the way free. You still gotta work. Right? That you still gotta work. Right? Politicians and white landowners mobilized all the resources they could to stymie them. Stymie, prevent, or hinder the progress of white landowners. Not only white landowners, slow down now. But they did all they could to prevent them from obtaining land. and southern state houses, they passed laws to ensure that you would work, to make it hard for you to work it for yourself. They didn't want you to be an entrepreneur. Right? The first states to pass new laws after the war were Mississippi and South Carolina, and both were clear in their objectives in what became known as Black Codes. Code de Niort, the 65 French Code de Niort. Right, this one was just to permit intermixture and influence. Right, but you know, even in a society where you do everything for yourself, you are the influence. Right, so the Code de Niort and Black Codes ain't too different, nah. They ain't too different, nah. This is American South, y'all. We was taking over so much that they had to really like do everything they could, law after law, to stymie us. They just wanted us to work. Yeah, you could work, but you can't own. Right? That's what it is. That's why things are set up the way they are today. It is a revolving door. Right? You will go in circles if you don't find a way to figure it out financially, health-wise. You know, health is wealth. But this is a part of the plan, to have you living life in a replay. Right? Like a true robot. A slave. Simply. The first states to pass the new laws after the war were Mississippi and South Carolina, and both were clear in their objectives in what became known as the Black Codes. Mississippi demanded that free people demonstrate proof that they had entered a labor contract or risk arrest or vagrancy. They will lock you up if you cannot provide proof of employment. They also directly forbade copper-colored people from renting or leasing land. You cannot rent or lease land. So they did everything they can to stop you from being an entrepreneur. South Carolina insisted that black people who wanted labor in non-agricultural pursuits must get permission from a court and purchase a license. U.S. government officials, including U.S. Army commanders stationed in these states, rejected such laws, and in January 1866, General and future President Ulysses S. Grant instructed all his subordinates to issue orders to keep protecting colored persons from persecutions for offenses for which white persons are not prosecuted or punished in the same manner or degree. Ulysses S. Grant wanted to protect folks. His father was a Whig, at that time. That's like saying a Republican, and I can't wait to read the history of the old Cherow's book, because we're going to talk about the Whigs and the Tories. Those are old political terms, He was a Republican, a Whig supporter, and an abolitionist, folks who wanted to abolish slavery. That's what they were part of. And Ulysses S. Grant, eventually, he achieved his little status or whatever, became the president. But see, the thing about his presidency, it was weird, because racism and slavery still was going on. However, the uppity black folks still had some power. You still had broke black people, poor black people as slaves, struggling to find ends meet. So he himself also another entrepreneur. Republicans, entrepreneurs. It was all about the dollar. It was all about the dollar with this brother, with Ulysses S. Grant. It's funny too, because he plays a role in the Mexican-American War, something that we're going to talk about real soon too. We're doing the history of Mexico right now. That's going to be one of my most favorite freaking series, because who would have knew, the Aztec bloodline finished in the blood of Sephardic Jewish folks. whose family's bloodline lives on until this day. People don't know that stuff. Right, but yeah, Ulysses S. Grant, another entrepreneur. But yeah, he prosecuted the Ku Klux Klan. He restored the Union, and he appointed African Americans and Jewish Americans to prominent federal offices. Right, because they helped the country flow, right, with wealth. The wealth, right, become wealthy. He created the first civil service commission, advancing the civil service more than any prior president. He was reelected in 72 in the presidential election, but was inundated by executive scandals during his second term. His response to the Panic of 1873 was ineffective in halting the Long Depression, which contributed to the Democrats winning the House majority in 1874. Right? The Democrats want the world to crumble, but the Republicans care about money. That's why people got to understand politics. Even Donald Trump himself, it's not about color. You know, they may make a lot of racist remarks and do things based off their emotions, but at the end of the day, it's all about money. The Democrats want you to rely on them, right? They want you to rely on them. What we said the definition was of emancipation was, right? To remove someone from bondage or slavery, release a person from parental care. In other words, when we talk about the Democrats and how they provide all of these incentives, like paying student loans, right? The food stamps and the HRA and all of that stuff, right? The Democrats lead the charge with that stuff. That's so that you can rely on them, remain relying on them, thus making you a slave, because to be emancipated means you rely on yourself. That's the Republican way. Money, do it on your own, build your own wealth, right? Even though we may say some racist things, as long as that paper is green, we gonna get in between. Count the green, get in between. Nah, for real though, this is why Donald Trump, right, he says the things he says, but people don't know. Before he even ran for president, the black community loved this nigga. Snoop Dogg, all of them, they loved Donald Trump. They did not hate Donald. They wanted all parts with Donald Trump. So when he started to run for president, that's when it was all like, oh nah, we can't have this nigga in the house. He can't be our leader. He can't lead this country. Right? But before, you was rocking with him, right? Because Donald Trump was a representation of a get money nigga. A true Republican. No race involved. Yeah, I may say some things, but I still want to get some bread. So where the money at? Let's make America great again. You know, and it sounds funny to hear this coming from me, but he was another Ulysses S. Grant, basically. Like I said, he did and said some crazy things. Grant did and said some crazy shit. He let a lot of shit slide. But he also was rocking with the guys. You see, him and Johnson was even cool. See? But they broke over Reconstruction policies. Right? Because he was on some like, nah, they gotta let's let them work for themselves. We could build a strong, prosperous economy. And Johnson was like, nah, I can't get down with that. They might get too powerful. Right? They might get too strong. You know, because I'm a sissy. You know, I'm a sis. That's what he is. Johnson is a sis. We're going to call Grant the bro, and Johnson is the sis. Right? Where we was at, though. Let's get back into this. Right? Let's get back into it. U.S. government officials, including U.S. Army commanders stationed in these states, rejected such laws, and in January 1866, Ulysses S. Grant instructed all his subordinates to issue orders protecting colored persons from prosecution for offenses for which white persons are not prosecuted or punished in the same manner or degree, right? That's equality, basically. It's equality, right? Now, we got to understand this, right? In America at the time, it's bad. Things is looking bad. In order to sway the public to be on your side, you gotta do stuff like that. Now, you want black people to vote for you? You want them to rock with you? You know, create ideologies and plans to help them prosper. You don't gotta care truly about them. You may not like black people, but if you want to win, you're gonna do what you gotta do. That's the Republican way. I'm telling y'all, things change. Politics is weird because parties switched, things changed, things had to be reconstructed. That's the point of the term, but politics, that's what it was. It's a little different now. In the coming years, southern states operating under President Johnson's Reconstruction plan enacted new laws that were less overtly discriminatory. Yet the intentions did not waver as they defined vagrancy ever more broadly and made it increasingly easy to arrest free people simply because they did not appear to be working for a white person. You would get booked if it didn't look like you was working for some white folks. This was under President Johnson's Reconstruction plan. This was Johnson's Reconstruction plan. He wanted to do stuff like that. Forever in bondage. Right? Even if you working, you will still be in bondage. It's still a form of bondage. Financial slavery. States banned hunting on private lands on Sundays to make it harder for poor people to feed themselves, and they passed regressive tax laws that placed extra burdens on those who did not own land. Right? Because, boom. Right, with Trump and his tax policies, they want to tax the rich. Right? And when the rich pay more taxes, you open up more doors for poor communities because they get to make more money now. Right? The taxes goes into the budget. Right? We increase the GDP. Now we can start paying out more people. We could pay people more. Right? We could get more labor facilities created, invest more money into infrastructure. Right? That's how finances work in America. Taxes go into all of that stuff. That's why when people talk about food stamps and all that, you be like, yo, this what my tax money paying for? Because they taxing us right now. The Democrats raise the taxes on us. We pay all the taxes. Right? What does it sound like? What it sound like? They passed regressive tax laws that placed extra burdens on those who did not own land. Another drop, right? Because entrepreneurs pay less in taxes. When you work for someone, you pay more in taxes. So if they create a system to keep you working forever, well, you're a slave forever and you will forever be under regressive tax laws. Not progressive tax laws. It just keeps getting worse and worse. As one Freedmen's Bureau agent wrote, of such laws, no reference to color was expressed in terms, but in practice, the distinction is invariable. Without land of their own, free people mostly work for others. Relationships between employers and employees assumed many different forms in slavery's immediate aftermath. Before the war, the enslaved labor force had been forcibly immobilized by masters' power to terrorize and punish their slaves. Sorry, y'all. It's getting hot. Had to turn that air on real quick. It's baking in New York City right now. Yeah, so what we got? All right, what else? Before the war, the enslaved labor force had been forcibly immobilized by masters' power to terrorize and punish their slaves. A power backed by public authorities and ultimately by the U.S. government itself. Slaves had nonetheless found ways of extracting compromises from masters and mistresses. By slowing their work or refusing it entirely, or by running away or otherwise registering discontent, slaves in many places had succeeded in winning small concessions within a relentless system. The things that they did not like, giving them too much freedom. That's another thing about a job, right? Employees hate it when staff members quit. All right, they even worse, they hate having to fire people because then you get to collect unemployment. Right? That's just a benefit that comes with being a slave. Unemployment would be considered reparations. Basically, for a slave, because they fired you and you got your get back. Right after they was able to be free, or just because of the laws constantly changing and having certain people in their corner, a lot of people understood their rights. Again, that whole idea that black people ain't know nothing, cap that, because they was out there slowing work and refusing it entirely. In the eastern seaboard rice plantations, slaves had pressed planters to establish a task system in which slaves required daily labor ended when they fulfilled a prescribed number of duties, thus giving them some control over their time. Elsewhere, however, planters had mobilized laborers in large groups, often called gangs, who worked under consistent and frequent brutal oversight, aka, right, what we know that as today. Right, I'll make the easy distinction for y'all right now. Chain gang, right, a group of prisoners chained together to perform menial or physical challenging work as a form of punishment. Chain gang is slavery. They do it till this day. Chain gang is a thing till this day. It's a form of slavery. The term gang is another word for a laborer. It's another term for group of laborers. That's what slave is. I mean, that's what a gang is. A group of laborers. The abolition of slavery, backed by the power of the U.S. government, placed Southern African Americans in an entirely new position. They were backed by the government, right? See, governments, Democrats, Unionists, Confederates, different entities, right? They not all the government, because you had stuff like this going on. Like, that whole entire era was weird, because it's like, dude, pick a side. What do you want? At the end of the day, we all eventually became gangs, you know, laborers, paid, but at least now you have the option to kind of do what you want. And your choices make up your future. Would you choose to rely on them? Right? Would you do the wrong things in life? Right? If you are working, do you value your labor enough to transition into something bigger? Or are you going to play with them ducats? You're going to play with your money, you a slave. Because you just taking that same money and spending it on them enslavement commodities. The whole goal of the Reconstruction era is so that we can become business owners, land owners, owners of our own life. Not so that we can be free and choose to work where we want. And liberate ourselves, right? And be bums, so to say. Right? Free people sought to negotiate labor arrangements. Oh, sorry, hold on. Yeah. Where we at? Right. Free people sought to negotiate labor arrangements that would allow them more control than in slavery. That honored their desires to cultivate families and communities. As freedom dawned, freedmen often sought to avoid working in large gangs and attempted instead to organize smaller work squads and enter labor agreements on behalf of a group of workers, often including women and children. Many employers were frustrated to find that freed women now refused to work in the fields as they had under slavery. In many instances, black families with new levels of control over their work and domestic lives chose to have women and children work at home on garden plots beyond the oversight of whites. This new labor arrangement could serve many different goals, including enabling freed women to spend more time taking care of their children, allowing families to enter new areas of economic activity, and reducing the chances that women would be subjected to sexual harassment and violence by white people, a common occurrence in slavery. I hate this because the worst slave owners in America were black. The Marie Therese Medioyas, the Anthony Johnsons, the William Ellisons, they were black. And they were some disgusting people. Not gonna lie. But this also proves too that the influence of the nurture and nature theory, it proves that when children have that love from their mother and father, no, Fox and Socks, that's what it is. I'm agreeing 100%. I'm agreeing 100%. We are POWs. We are still slaves. We work jobs. Right? We are prisoners of war. Right? Locked into contracts, right? That we have to abide to in order to become or to achieve the American dream. To quote unquote achieve their version of the American dream. But that's not, that's why I'm trying to tell people, like, we got to be aware of it, even Juneteenth within itself. Like in the beginning, I was saying that Juneteenth is a fraud holiday, right? Emancipation, it means when you release from a person from parental care and responsibility. But when you are working for someone, you are relieving yourself of that personal responsibility to build and become a person truly basking in his freedom. You cannot embrace your freedom if you are still relying on someone else to take care of your responsibilities. We all need a paycheck at the end of the day. We all need a paycheck at the end of the day, for sure. But then in that same token, there's ways to get it. So, like I said, in that same token, were we truly emancipated? No. We were shifted from being slaves to prisoners of war. That's a beautiful way to put it. That's a beautiful way to put it. That's a beautiful way to put it. Right? But yeah, like I said, in that same token, it shows that when the mother and father, right, are in the household, right, you have better results, right? Because when freed women and freed men were allowed to spend time with their family, they entered new areas of economic activity. That's what they're saying. Meanwhile, black women who did domestic works for whites, including cooking, washing, and housework, now attempted to negotiate the terms of their employment, often infuriating their former mistresses, who in turn ended up doing much more such work than they had previously. Freed people and planters often struggled over the question of who controlled children's labor. Children were objects of their parents' affection, but also, particularly as they grew older, important sources of work and income. Parents were even forcing their children to work. Freed people. Right, and I'm going to put y'all on, right, even in the census records at the time, you had two different types of censuses. I always mention this. Two different types of census. One that counted the slaves on the plantation or at the home, and one that counted the family members. And a lot of times, family members were being labeled on the census as slaves, and on the other census as family members. So, even these free people, they were well accustomed to having slaves, right? You making your kids 10, 11, 12 years old work on the field. Now, of course, that's creating that beast, right, to earn an honest living, but is that any way for a 10, 11, 12-year-old to be spending their life? Like, of course, yeah, you get the affection, but you still going through the hardships of the slave. Like, I asked my grandmother this before. She told me when she used to pick cotton, she liked it. It was fun. It was fun. I'm like, oh, shit. Because, listen, I wouldn't pick cotton for nobody but myself. Or unless you giving me like 800K, I pick the whole damn field. Promise you. Not gonna lie. Not gonna lie. Not gonna say ain't cap. Not gonna lie. Right, but landowners well understood the economic value of children and teenagers and regularly colluded with law enforcement officials and courts to apprentice freed children to whites without consent of their parents. Ooh, look at that. Right, being stripped from their parents. The law, like all these things being used to work against freed people being successful or regaining their success. Right, relatives in turn demanded custody of and authority of their children. They sometimes turned to Freedmen's Bureau agents and other officials for help recouping their children, or they took matters into their own hands and attempted to rescue their children from the involuntary servitude of forced apprenticeship. Forging a satisfactory employment contract was only the beginning. Right, see? Employment is still slavery. It's still slavery, y'all. Labor. Yep, look, trafficking the children. Yes, that is trafficking. Right? People advocated so much for abolishing child labor warehouses and camps, like stuff like that in the UK and in America. But who would have knew, right? Free people was doing that stuff to their own kids. That's madness. My father, right, and this is how I know it's real. Willie Lynch theory, y'all. When I was 11, 12 years old, that's when I first started working. That's when I first started working with my dad. But thank God, right, I was able to keep my eyes open enough to see that what he was doing was slave labor. And I had so much to say, like to the boss, to the co-workers. Like, they didn't like it. They was like, yo, like, get this little nigga out of here. They ain't like it, but I'm saying, like, yo, like, I'm being real with them. All that dust you inhaling, you gonna get sick. Oh, I'm not doing this job. This is slavery. Because it's true. That's what it was. They thought of it as an honest living, right? That's what our parents is gonna think. We making an honest living. Oh, it's an honest living. Or you working hard. Nah, that's labor, y'all. That's labor. And if my pops knew better, he would have knew that would have been, that's like human trafficking. He sold me off to the lowest bidder. Because even though I was making bread, that work could have killed me. Like, anything could have happened, right? It's the same stuff, right? But yeah, look, even under the best conditions, southern agricultural laborers struggled to get paid, and employers sometimes struggled to pay them, right? Laborers weren't getting a bag, so they weren't able to pay out that bag. Money was in short supply in the post-war South, right? The war took all of the bread. It took all of the money. And many employers were themselves in debt. In a place where cash was scarce, it was no simple matter to institute a system and where agricultural workers were paid wages. It wasn't easy. That's what they're saying. It wasn't easy for people to start making money from work. Driven by their desire for independence and by the limited cash supply, many free people agreed to be paid in a share of the crop after it was harvested. Some in turn arranged to be paid in wages after the landowner had sold the crop. In those instances, the owner retained control of the harvest and, at least in theory, doled out money to employers after selling it. With planters indebted to the people who sold them the seeds, tools, and fertilizer, however, such relationships could be complicated at harvest time. Who entitled to be paid first, the laborers or the creditors? So it was either pay the people who were providing the assets, or it was to pay the people who were working for the assets. Right? So if you can't pay the people, they technically working for free. But if you don't pay the creditor, then you won't be able to have any work for the laborers, thus keeping you poor or keeping you in debt. Right? This contributed to a lot of the tension and race wars here in America, because this kept planters, and predominantly those who were of a lighter complexion, poor and a lower class. And this is not what they wanted. Yo, bro, you want to know something about the coal mines that's crazy? Fox and Socks, I watched the video about the coal mines. You know how many people die per year working in the coal mines, bro? Yo, bro, it's people that worked in the coal mines. The life expectancy of a coal mine worker is nothing past 50 to 60 years old. I would be damned if I ever have to work in a coal mine. Promise that. Promise that. I will be damned. For real. See, bro? You see, bro? You see? My condolences, bro. My condolences, because if it wasn't for that labor, you would have been able to chop it up with your grandpa about everything. And I'm not saying you didn't. Let me rephrase that. But is so much that y'all could have spoke about, right? But that coal mine did them dirty. But it's like that for a lot of our ancestors. Same with my ancestors, right? A lot of them died working in them situations, right? It's labor. It's slavery. Mind you, it's the 1920s, 30s, 40s. It's still slavery, because your life like, how are you expected to live? How can a job calculate how long you gonna live? That's the same thing for the slaves on the field. They had a life expectancy. Yes, bro. Yes. Yes, bro. Yes. Yes, bro. Yes. For white Southerners who had owned slaves and relied on them to grow their staple crops, the transition to a regime of free labor was difficult. To many, it was almost unfathomable that former slaves, persons once immobilized by laws and by the looming threat of violence, were now free to leave their homes and places of work. Whipping, a common form of discipline in labors during slavery, was now supposed to be outlawed. In every realm of life, free people demanded freedom, dignity, and autonomy. Moreover, planters had not only lost the war, but suffered vast financial losses as a result of the abolition of slavery, which it eliminated without compensation a form of property once essential to Southern economic life. This is why people are extremely racist today. They were racist before, right? But remember, like I said, everything wasn't always black and white. After the abolition of slavery, they had so much hate for colored people because they took away their reason to live, their economic life. They cannot feed their children. This was the cause of racism. Not because it's black and white, right? Because back then, like back a long time ago, even in Europe, right? A lot of people like to make the Moorish stuff and the wars and stuff over there. They like to make it black and white. But even then, it's all about power and wealth and dominance. Because black people dominated other black people. That's what it's always and gonna be about for the rest of time, right? Racism is a propagated agenda created to put this false reality in the minds of white and black people. It exists, but only to those who are gullible enough to indulge. Right? People say this all the time. Well, you get discriminated at jobs. Well, look for a different job. Where if they're going to discriminate you, at least they do not do it in front of your face. Because it's going to happen one way or the other. This is the mindset. This is the mental thing. Mental enslavement. That's what it is. Right? Southerners found the situation difficult to endure and felt personally humiliated and dejected by their losses. Some wrote in diaries and personal letters about their sense of upheaval, uncertainty, and even panic. Many smallholding white farmers had also suffered losses in the war, even if they did not own slaves, right? Creating that poor white class. The war left a lot of folks broke. Like I said, the war, right? Soldiers away at the front could not farm, and remaining family members struggled to sustain crops. Armies on both sides took food, supplies, horses, and livestock, sometimes without compensation. And the disorganization of Southern society with its war-torn railroads and shuttered banks made it hard to reestablish the transportation networks and credit necessary to run even a small farm. To regain the upper hand, employers regularly resorted to violence and fraud to avoid paying their laborers, who at the end of the season were particularly vulnerable to exploitation. Many Southern landowners responded to emancipation by taking the mandates of new free labor economy seriously, promising employee wages but denying them substance, food, and clothing masters had provided to their slaves. So now, slaves had to go without food and clothing. They get the funds, but now those funds in return have to be spent on the food and clothing. Like I said, it's a cycle. Because after you spend the money on the food and clothing, you're now back crawling to the master, because he's the one providing you the means to make that money, not you yourself. Not you yourself. Right? Not you yourself. So it's keeping the laborer in a cycle, right? And it's like a life or death cycle. Well, I gotta work just to live, but if I don't work, I'ma die. But if I work, I'ma die either way. So I gotta die to live and live to die. Free people now have to use their meager wages to pay for basic necessities, right? Before, when you would live off the land, that's why I said, right, with the slavery in America, right, with slavery in America, like I said, who were the slaves? Right? Indians from Virginia were forbidden to pass north to the Potomac River west of the Great Ridge of the mountains. The penalty for breaking this treaty was death or transportation to the West Indies, there to be sold as slaves. Who were the slaves? Here in America, the folks who lived off the land. A large percentage of Indians enslaved in Virginia had been transported to other North American colonies or the West Indies. The slaves in America, those folks who were living off the land, now had to get their first experience of what we live today. Right? This is what we go through today. You die to live to die. You make minimum wage, you can't enjoy yourself. You can't go have fun, right? You can't do nothing, right? And then on top of that, a degree dictates how valuable you are in this world. That's slavery, because they're saying one way or the other, you're going to have to be institutionalized, my brother. One way or the other, before you can sit up here with us. Right? Mind ya, a degree is another staple for, hey, welcome to the Freemason Club. I'm spitting facts, just letting y'all know. Summa cum laude and all of that, the doctrines and all of that, that's welcome to the Freemason Club. You can keep it. I'm okay. And this is not to shoot people down who are in school. Go to school. Make something great of yourself. Right? Become something. Right? Because it's better than being nothing. Right? You could be like me and sit in the crib and read all day and make these videos for the YouTube community. Or you could really go be something. Either way, we both gonna be something. What I'm saying is, do something. Right? But just remember what I'm telling you. It's a form of being institutionalized slavery. Either way, you're gonna have to go through our process and do what we say for you to be accepted into this upper echelon. Right? That's why I always say get a trade. Right? Because with a trade, you could create your own school. Right? Copper Color Productions, man. We got our trade. And we got a coloring book dropping real soon. Keep y'all posted on that. But yeah, so free people now had to use their meager wages to pay for basic necessities. And many planters were only too happy to oblige. Keeping track of the debts their workers owed them and reconciling accounts at the end of the season, which was the only time most agricultural workers were paid. Not surprisingly, at harvest time, free people often faced employers who claimed they had already spent their year's pay. Right? They already spent their year's pay. Just like today. People spend they week check in a day. It's the same as today. It's no different. Some employers did not even bother with such niceties and simply ran their laborers off the property, sometimes at gunpoint after the harvest was complete. Under these conditions, the laborers who appeared to have the least productive capacity, children, the elderly, and single mothers, appeared most disposable to employers and were most likely to be evicted and otherwise exploited, in other terms, prostituted. Right? Prostitution was a big thing too at that time. Right? Prostitution was a big thing. Right? But we got a lot more to go, right? I don't want to, keep people up for too long, right? There's one more part I would like to share, as a matter of fact, before we even conclude this, because we're going to pick up this part 2 tomorrow, for sure. 9:00 p.m., man. If we can make it there. 9 to 10, check it out. We're going to be lit. But look, it says, as these examples indicate, the policies of Southern state governments significantly shaped labor relations. Where Republicans held political power, they raised taxes on land and personal property and passed labor lane laws that provided that employers would pay their employees first before discharging other debt obligations. Right? This means before paying others or even paying back their debts, the laborers had to get paid first. Right? This is another way of saying before taxes. I appreciate it. That's another way of saying, though, like before taxes. Right? They had to pay them first. So you would, back at one point, Republicans were saying like, yeah, before taxes, you got to get your bread. Right? And then pay other people after that. Pay your taxes after that. But before taxes, pay your staff, basically. When it came to encouraging small farmers to buy land, South Carolina went furthest, creating a state land commission to purchase land and resell it on favorable terms to small farmers. In the early 1870s, the experiment was notably successful, with about 14,000 black families and few whites availing themselves of this unusual route to land ownership. Right? What they saying, South Carolina had more black people with money owning land, getting shit done, than there was Caucasian folks. Now, what changed this is something most people like to describe as the big migration, right? Where now the lynchings and the violence was now driving people, black folks in the South, back north, right? This is about 30 to 40 years after this time period right here, right? Now check this out. Republic legislators also invested heavily in railroad development, which helped connect traditional southern port cities with the rural hinterlands, creating transportation networks that encouraged yeoman farmers living in non-plantation districts to try their hand at growing staple crops for sale at the market. When Democrats regained control at different moments in different states and many areas, they reversed Republicans' course. For instance, Democrats passed laws that favored creditors and employers over laborers. Okay, so remember when I was saying they was like, you gotta pay the laborers before you pay your creditors, right? So we was getting before taxes. The Democrats said, nah, they gotta get the after taxes. You pay your creditors and the employers first. And they reinstituted in racial neutral terms harsh vagrancy laws akin to those passed during the immediate post-war years. And when rural workers managed to organize for better conditions, Democratic governors readily called out their militias to break strikes and support the resumption of low-wage plantation agriculture. Right? They wanted the worst. Right? And it's still till this day. Still till this day, these goddamn Democrats. That's what I call them. Democrats. Demons. Democrats. I'm not a Republican, right? I'm gonna be honest though. If I was to classify myself with any political party without knowing any of this information, I would say I am one. Right? Because I'm one of them people who believe like, yo, you gotta get it how you gotta get it. Right? Be a creator. Right, especially now, I'm so happy computers and all of that stuff is a thing because I'm so good with them. Right, you got to do something big, be different. Right, don't be like the rest of the folks, sheep and followers, because that's that same stuff that had you enslaved in the first place. When the colonizers came to our land, some of us was mixing in, right? This is why they wanted the Code Nord. This is why the French implemented the Code Nord. We were mixing in, mingling, being friendly. That set us back. That's not something we were supposed to do because, listen, with assimilation comes the introduction of a new style of living, new cultures. Right? New ways of living. Things that were once meant to make you stronger are now being used against you and being used to break you. Like how you got to pay for water. That's crazy. Every time I ask myself, every time I buy a case of water, I always say like, yo, bro, for example, today, Shorty tried to charge me $20 for 2 cases of water. First thing I thought, I might as well go out into the Bronx River and filter that shit myself. For real. For real. $20 for water is insane. That's insane. How you gotta pay for water when it used to be free? That's slavery. Right, but hey, money make the world go round, right? White Southerners also turned to law enforcement officials to control the labor power of African Americans and to press it into the service of white business owners. This was the goal, right? To keep the slaves on the plantation even if we still paying them. To keep them reliant on us. To disregard their emancipation, right? And keep them relying on us so that they will feel like They're indebted to us. Yeah, bro, for sure. Yeah. I'm out here. Born and raised. Born and raised in the Bronx. Right? During the 1870s and 1880s, prison officials increasingly leased prisoners to planters and other businessmen at lower cost than the rate of pay for free workers. We were still considered commodities. Right? Lease. That's something you do with a car or a crib. They out here leasing people like it's a furniture store. Right? You and I never leased furniture before, but I always hear them say stuff like how if you don't pay them, they come knocking. Well, that's why I compared it to like leasing furniture. It's the same stuff. Commodities. The 13th Amendment had exempted prisoners from its ban on involuntary servitude. The convict lease system provided revenue to support prisoners and law enforcement, while also offering a cheap labor force and thus generate profits for business owners. Right? The prisoners were paying to build the city. This is why they invest so much money into the prison system. Yeah, so much for Reconstruction. Right? This is why they invest bread into the prison system. That's the cheapest labor force in America, other than immigrants. Prisoners and immigrants. Cheapest labor force. They'll work the hardest for the lowest amount of money. That is slavery. Convict leasing helped propel the South's economic recovery after the war. Right? How? Right? After emancipation, after the war, convict leasing built the South? So even after being free, convicts was still using their work to build the South? Slavery was still building the South? How many people knew that though? So much for your emancipation. Yeah, haha, June. So much for Juneteenth. Yet critics increasingly drew attention to the abuses inherent in the system. Some argued that selective private business owners should not be permitted to profit from the convicts' labor, but that prisoner labor should be directed to projects that serve the public good, right? To build the infrastructure, right? Still keep them slaves, right? Nah, not just stop the work. Right? Don't like they didn't even say stop the work. They said, nah, we just gonna use this to build the economy. So much for your emancipation. Other reformers pointed out that leased prisoners, the vast majority of whom were African Americans, lived in inhumane conditions, essentially unfree and vulnerable to the whims of prison officials and private leases. Among the earliest and most vocal public critics of the convict leasing was George Washington Cable, a white writer and Confederate veteran from New Orleans who lambasted the system in speeches and in print in the 1880s. Right, so he was against it. Like this Confederate leader, they saying that's a white man. Right, they saying he a white man, but we know George Washington Cable, right, that could be both either a black or a white man. A mulatto potentially too, coming out of New Orleans. However, I forgot how they pronounce it. Subject to intense hostility in his native city, in 1885 he and his family moved to Northampton, Massachusetts, where he lived and continued to write for the next 30 years. As the progressive era dawned, states gradually responded to reformers' critics and calls for modernization by ceasing to rent prisoners to private businesses and employing them instead in public works projects. Indeed, prisoners furnished much of the labor that built the roads and other infrastructure of the New South in the early decades of the 20th century. The laborers, remember, laborers is a gang. These same people building the railroads and stuff, they was on the chains. That was the chain gangs. That was the chain gangs. Right? like I said, there's much more that we gonna go over. Right, that was just chapter 1. Right, see, look. Like-minded African Americans organized branches of Colored Farmers Alliance, which was attuned to the needs of landless black agricultural laborers. And then the farmers, right, the white Southern farmers galvanized to challenge the powerful Democratic Party, whose officials typically represented the interests of wealthy merchants and planters, right? State agrarians like North Carolina's Elias Garr gained control of the Democratic Party from older Bourbon Democrats, Bourbon meaning French Democrats, right? These are the Frenchmen, and began to reform state politics. In some states, white alliance men joined the new Populist Party, and in the process made common cause with the black Republicans. So you had the Colored Farmers Allegiance, and then you had the Populist Party. 2 different parties, but they were working together. In North Carolina, for instance, the combined Populist and Republican parties won control of the state, electing both U.S. senators, the governor, and majority of the legislature. And in Georgia for a time, fiery orator Tom Watson aimed to unite the white and black farmers. The ideology of white supremacy was fragile enough to give some white Southerners space to ally briefly with black Republicans, proving that white supremacy wasn't really, it wasn't really like too tough. It wasn't too tough, so things had to be created to push this white supremacy agenda, right? And people don't understand that, right? It's propaganda. It's all propaganda, right? This is why the TV is dangerous. Billboards, the news, all of that stuff is dangerous. You got right-wing propaganda, left-wing propaganda, news outlets saying Trump is a rapist and he's being indicted. Other news outlets saying Trump is innocent and that his lawyers is doing this, that, and the third to help fight and then you got outlets that represent Biden and then demonstrate Biden. I mean, go against Biden. Right? It's all propaganda. Propaganda. They use propaganda to push white supremacy. Check this out. And we're going to end this off with this right here because this is the biggest banger thus far in the first chapter. Democrats, crackheads, ran sophisticated propaganda campaigns to scare white populists back into the party, raising fears of black domination and particularly inventing stories of black male rapists. All of these black men being lynched because they allegedly tried to holler at the white girl. They are all propagated stories. This is why the white girl that got the fatty that live up the block be nervous when she walk past you in the guys. Not all of them, I ain't gonna lie. She loves me a snow bunny, but not all of them. But this is why, because of that idea that, we're animals and quote unquote and this, that, and the third, right? They're saying who ran it. It wasn't all white people. It was just these people, Democrats, these people. Not all white people. Right? So what is racism again, right? That's 1. 2, propaganda. Right? White populists were invested in the system of racial hierarchy that always kept them a rung higher than their black counterparts. And there we gonna drop that right there. Right, we're gonna leave it right there. Right, this is why I had to talk about this, because first off, we got to get this straight. how we weren't emancipated, right? We have the right to do whatever we want to do, right? You have the right to make whatever choices you want to make. But in some way, shape, or form, oh yeah, no doubt, Brody. No doubt. No doubt. No doubt, for sure. They didn't want to compete with colored folks. That's the thing. Like, they didn't want to compete with colored folks. Even though colored folks would have just made each other compete with themselves, right? Because we in competition with other colored folks now. The uppity bourgeoisie, right? The uppity elite. We have an elite class of black people too. So, right, and they don't do much for us. So, at the end of the day, the Reconstruction era, you could look at it from many different perspectives, right? Like, you could look at it from like, okay, yep, we have the chance to be entrepreneurs now. And then we could look at it from like, okay, this is the start of systematic racism. And then we could look at it from the start of like, this is where labor was introduced, like on black people, like on why you gotta work. Like, it's many different directions to look at the Reconstruction era, right? But at the same time, with all of that Reconstruction, it didn't do much, right? Look at how things are today, especially with the presidency, the propaganda, right? All that we done seen ever since, you know, since 2020. Right? It's just a lot, right? And what happened during the Reconstruction era, right? That history is playing out in the world that we see today as we speak. You just have to be open enough to pay attention and see it, right? You just got to pay attention to what you see going on around you. For sure, it helped the elite. That's who it helped, the elite. Because it's people like myself, many other people, we still thugging and bugging. We still trying to figure it out. We are still trying to figure it out. But there's nothing wrong with that, right? Because we are trying to take the power away from them. Yes, sir. Ding, ding, ding. Ding, ding, ding. Get with it or get crushed. That's what it is. Get with it or get crushed. Get with it or get crushed. That's why the elite, that's why they kick it with each other like that. The Michael Rubin parties and all of that. That's why they kick it with each other like that. You know? But I ain't going to speak too much on that, right? I ain't going to speak too much on that, man. We got part 2 of this. We're going to keep talking. We're going to keep getting back into this. And it's going to be so cool to tie in Mexico's quote-unquote Reconstruction era with what's happened in America. Because they had this same situation going on over there. And it played out even more in color. Because the people of color were going against each other from the start. Right? There was never no white and black with the Spaniards, with Spanish. There was never no white or black. Them peoples was colored too. And it was dealing with the colored inhabitants here in America. Right? It was light skin, right? Dark skin, that's what it is. Full blood Spanish. You half blood. It's a lot, bro. That's why we do what we do, man. Breaking the black barrier. Make sure y'all stay in tune for the next one. We're going crazy. Trying to stay consistent with this content. Trying to build this fan base, man. If you know friends, if you got friends who are in tune with stuff like this, share this to them. Let them know. We get active. Right? And everything we do, we read through everything. We read through all of the information. We make all our correlations, different references. You know, we make it happen. As a matter of fact, I forgot to even show y'all. Right? I forgot to even show y'all. Oh, man. Like I said, I was going to show y'all some fire, right? J. Edgar Hoover. Was he black? He was a black man. Nah, he wasn't full black. I'm gassing it. But he was mixed raced. Right, look. This is from an authentic Washington Post article. We're going to cover this in the next one. Right? A lady, McGee, said in the 1950s, I was a young girl growing up in rural Macomb, Mississippi. The story had been passed down through several generations that the land we lived on was owned by the Hoover family. My grandfather told me that this powerful man, Edgar Hoover, was his second cousin and was passing for white. If we talked about this, him being black, he was so powerful he can have us all killed. I grew up terrified about all of this. This is from the Washington Post. J. Edgar Hoover, mixed race, tells us a lot about American history. But like I said, man, stay tuned for the next one. Copper Color King. Follow us on all platforms. Copper Color King, YouTube. Like, comment, subscribe. We're going to go crazy in the next one, man. Let's get it. Breaking the black barrier. What is black?